Welcome to Compact Murder from CompactHistories.com, where we take a look at real murder cases, assassinations and serial killers in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 88, The Murder of Robert Pakington. Robert Pakington was born sometime around 1489 in Stanford-on-Thames, Worcestershire, England. He was a younger son of John Pakington and Elizabeth Washbourne. As a younger son, he could not expect to inherit the family's entire position or property. His future would depend upon the profession, connections and reputation he built for himself. London offered opportunities unavailable in a rural parish, and Pakington entered the world of commerce through an apprenticeship with the Mercers Company. By 1510 he had completed his apprenticeship and become part of one of London's most influential livery companies. Membership brought more than permission to trade. The company offered fellowship, charitable support, religious identity and access to a powerful network. For an ambitious merchant, it also provided a recognised place within the government and social hierarchy of the city. Mercers dealt principally in fine textiles and luxury goods, but their business stretched far beyond the boundaries of London. Pakington became involved in exporting English cloth and importing merchandise from continental Europe. Antwerp, one of the great commercial centres of the period, was particularly important to his trade. A successful mercer needed capital, reliable agents, knowledge of foreign markets, and the ability to operate within a network of merchants, officials, and shipowners. Pakington prospered. In 1527 and 1528, he served as a warden of the Mercers Company, evidence that his fellow merchants regarded him as a man capable of taking responsibility within the organisation. By the final years of his life, he was a wealthy figure. He was assessed at 500 marks for the subsidy of 1534, exported about 250 cloths to Antwerp in 1535, and left cash gifts worth more than £300 in his will. These were considerable sums in Tudor England, and place him firmly among London's substantial citizens. His personal life also connected him to powerful families. His first wife, Agnes Baldwin, was the daughter of Sir John Baldwin, who became Chief Justice of the Common Pleas. Pakington and Agnes had sons and daughters together. After her death he married Catherine Dallam, the widow of another mercer, Richard Collier. Pakington was therefore not an isolated tradesman newly arrived from the countryside. He belonged to a web of commercial, legal and family relationships reaching through the City of London and beyond. His home stood in Cheapside, close to Soper Lane and opposite the Mercers' Chapel of St. Thomas of Acre. Cheapside was crowded, noisy and commercially prestigious, a place where status could be measured by one's neighbours as readily as by one's accounts. Yet Pakington did more than accumulate wealth. The Mercers increasingly trusted him to represent their interests, and those responsibilities drew him towards Parliament. Once there, his criticism of the clergy would give his public career a far more dangerous edge. Pakington's move into public affairs began through the Mercers Company. In 1523, and again in 1529, he was chosen with other members to prepare articles for presentation to Parliament. These documents were intended to protect the company's interests, but the complaints of 1529 reportedly included sharp criticism of the clergy. English merchants could encounter ecclesiastical power through church courts, probate charges, mortuary payments and other fees. So hostility to clerical privilege did not automatically make a man a religious revolutionary. Even so, Pakington was speaking at a moment when criticism of the Church was becoming politically explosive. The Parliament summoned in 1529 became known as the Reformation Parliament. Henry VIII initially wanted help securing the end of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, but the resulting confrontation with Rome developed into a much broader transformation. Parliament restricted clerical powers and payments, recognised the king's supremacy over the English Church, and helped dismantle papal authority in England. Reformers, traditionalists, royal servants and men concerned primarily with legal or financial grievances all operated within the same unsettled political world. Pakington entered the House of Commons in an October 1533 by-election as one of the representatives for the City of London, and was probably returned again for the Parliament of 1536. The chronicler Edward Hall remembered him as someone who spoke against the greed and harshness of the clergy. Hall wrote after Pakington's death and viewed the period through a reformist lens, but his account supports the picture of a merchant whose criticism had become publicly visible. There are also stronger indications that Pakington's sympathies went beyond complaints about fees. In the final years of his life, he passed information concerning events in Flanders to Thomas Cromwell through Cromwell's associate Stephen Vaughan. Antwerp was not only a commercial hub, but also a centre through which reformist books and English translations of scripture circulated. No surviving evidence proves that Pakington personally smuggled forbidden books, and it would be wrong to turn possibility into fact. His connection with Vaughan and Cromwell nevertheless placed him close to men actively involved in advancing religious change. The language of Pakington's will has also been interpreted as evidence of evangelical belief, particularly its emphasis upon faith and salvation. Historians often use the word evangelical rather than Protestant for people like him, because religious identities in the 1530s had not yet settled into the later divisions. Pakington still attended Mass, yet he associated with reformers and criticised clerical power. By November 1536, England was deeply divided. The Pilgrimage of Grace had placed much of the north in rebellion against the government's religious policies. In London, fear and rumour accompanied news of the uprising. Against that background, Pakington followed his familiar morning routine and stepped out into Cheapside, unaware that his predictable journey had placed him within reach of a waiting attacker. Sunday, the 13th of November 1536, began with exceptionally heavy mist over London. According to the account later published by John Fox, Pakington regularly left his house in the early morning to pray at the church opposite. The building was the chapel of St. Thomas of Acre, closely associated with the Mercers' Company. Crossing Cheapside required only a short walk, and the regularity of that journey may have made his movements easy to predict. Cheapside was normally one of London's busiest streets. It served as a commercial artery lined with shops, houses, and the premises of wealthy citizens. At that early hour, however, the mist reduced visibility and softened the outlines of buildings and people. Labourers were gathered near the end of Soper Lane, and neighbours were close enough to hear what happened. They heard the discharge of a firearm, but nobody was able to identify the person who fired it. Pakington had been shot and fatally wounded before he could reach the chapel. The surviving descriptions are frustratingly brief. They do not provide a dependable account of the assassin's position, the precise range, the route of escape, or the medical damage caused by the projectile. Later retellings have sometimes added a cart, a concealed gunman, or a carefully described shot to the head. Such details produce a vivid scene, but the principal early accounts do not securely establish them. However, what can be said is stark enough. A prominent merchant and Member of Parliament was killed in a public London street by an unseen attacker using a gun. The weapon itself has usually been described as a wheel-lock pistol. That is plausible, but it is not certain. Early chroniclers referred simply to a gun, and no murder weapon is known to have been recovered. The wheel-lock mechanism had appeared in Europe around 1500 and could ignite its charge mechanically, without the constantly burning cord required by a matchlock. Surviving wheel-lock firearms date from before Pakington's murder, and the technology helped make smaller, one-handed weapons practical. A wheel-lock could be prepared in advance, concealed more readily and fired quickly, qualities well suited to an assassination. The mist also mattered. A matchlock depended upon a glowing length of slow match, which could betray the user through light, smell or smoke, and could be troublesome in damp weather. A wheel lock was expensive and mechanically complicated, suggesting access to an unusual and valuable weapon. Yet without the firearm, the safest conclusion is only that Pakington was murdered with a portable gun, probably using wheel lock technology. The sound brought immediate attention, but the mist had hidden the crucial moment. Anyone running from the area could quickly become another indistinct figure among streets, alleys, doorways, and awakening households. The killer disappeared, leaving frightened witnesses, a dead parliamentarian, and a crime unlike anything Londoners were accustomed to confronting. The killing immediately created a practical problem. People had heard the shot, but hearing a weapon was not the same as seeing who held it. There was no recovered firearm to connect with an owner, no modern examination of a projectile, no system of fingerprints, and no organised police force capable of reconstructing movements across the city. Tudor authorities could question witnesses, search property, circulate descriptions and offer money for information, but a prepared assassin who had escaped the scene possessed a formidable advantage. A substantial reward was offered for information. The surviving references describe it as a great reward, although they do not preserve a clear account of its amount or of the people who attempted to claim it. The offer demonstrates that Pakington's death was treated seriously, and that authorities hoped someone within the city's dense network of households, workshops and inns knew something useful. Nevertheless, no person was convicted, and no surviving record provides the kind of detailed investigative narrative familiar from later murder cases. 3 days after the killing, on the 16th of November, Pakington was buried at his parish church of St Pancras in Soper Lane. The church stood close to his home and was later destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. John Stowe recorded that a monument was erected there to Pakington's memory. The funeral sermon was preached by Robert Barnes, a prominent evangelical reformer who had spent time in Germany and had connections with Martin Luther's circle. Barnes's involvement reinforced the impression that Pakington belonged among England's reform-minded religious network. His estate reveals the abrupt personal consequences behind the public crime. Pakington had made his will in November 1535, almost a year before his death, and it was proved in April 1537. He left substantial cash bequests and made arrangements involving his wife, children, relatives, and associates. Under the customs of the City of London, children whose fathers had died could be treated as civic orphans, allowing the city to supervise their inherited property. In November 1537, Pakington's son and heir, Thomas, was placed in the custody of his maternal grandfather, Sir John Baldwin. Pakington's widow Catherine later married Sir Michael Dormer, another wealthy mercer who became Lord Mayor of London. His children likewise continued within prosperous and influential families. The murder therefore failed to erase the Pakington name, but it denied the family any formal resolution. There was no trial at which evidence could be tested, and no sentence that fixed responsibility. Into that empty space came rumour, sharpened by grief, politics, and the human reluctance to accept that a conspicuous killing might remain unanswered. Pakington's religious associations encouraged reformers to interpret him as a martyr, while the mystery allowed every later writer to supply the culprit the original investigation had never found. The earliest influential explanations of Pakington's murder were written by Protestant reformers who believed conservative churchmen had arranged his death. John Bale suggested in 1545 that hostile bishops were responsible. Edward Hall's Chronicle, published in 1548, also connected the killing with Pakington's criticism of the clergy. These accounts appeared after England's religious struggle had sharpened considerably, and both writers had reasons to portray opponents of reform as capable of secret violence. John Fox developed the accusation further, but his story did not remain consistent. In 1559 he reported that John Stokesley, the former Bishop of London, had paid a priest 60 gold coins to carry out the murder. Stokesley had been a determined opponent of religious heresy, so he made a convincing villain for a Protestant account. Convincing, however, is not the same as proven. Fox supplied no surviving legal record, named eyewitness or independently verifiable confession linking Stokesley to the shooting. The version published in Fox's 1563 Acts and Monuments shifted attention to John Incent, a former Dean of St. Paul's. Fox claimed that Incent had confessed before his death to arranging Pakington's murder. Catholic writer Nicholas Harpsfield challenged the accusation, arguing that Fox had slandered a dead man. When Fox revised his work again in 1570, the narrative changed once more and included an Italian as the person who had carried out the killing. The changes may reflect new rumours reaching Fox, but they also reveal how uncertain his information was. Other chroniclers did not simply confirm Fox. John Stowe and Richard Grafton recorded the killing without adopting all of his clerical accusations. Raphael Holinshed preserved a different tale in which a criminal facing execution at Banbury confessed from the gallows that he had murdered Pakington. A confession made at the point of death might sound powerful, particularly to Tudor readers, but the identity of the supposed felon and the evidence supporting the story remain unclear. Religious assassination is certainly a plausible theory. Pakington had criticised clerical power, associated with evangelicals, and gathered information for Cromwell's network. His death occurred during the Pilgrimage of Grace, when resistance to religious change had created an atmosphere of fear and political violence. One modern study has argued that this climate may have encouraged an attack upon a man regarded as an evangelical ally of the government. Yet plausibility cannot convict a bishop, dean, priest, Italian gunman, or condemned felon. Pakington was also a wealthy international merchant involved in debts, lawsuits, and competitive trade, although nothing surviving identifies a commercial enemy with a murder plan. The sources allow several motives to be imagined, but none to be demonstrated. By the time named suspects appeared in print, the actual gunman had vanished into history, leaving later generations to judge stories created long after the sound of the shot had faded. Robert Pakington's death is frequently described as the first murder committed with a handgun in London, and sometimes as the first in England or Britain. The narrower London claim is the most defensible, but even that requires careful wording. It is better described as the earliest recorded or earliest known London murder involving a portable firearm. Earlier firearm killings may have occurred without surviving documentation, and the 16th century word gun did not always provide the technical precision expected by modern readers. The likelihood of a wheel lock remains important. The mechanism was developed in Europe around the beginning of the 16th century, and an early example in the Royal Armouries is dated to about 1520. Unlike the matchlock, the wheel lock produced sparks through a spring-driven rotating wheel. It was costly and complicated, but it allowed a firearm to be carried ready for use without a burning match. The technology contributed to the emergence of pistols that could be handled with one hand and used from horseback or at close range. Those features made the wheel lock more than a military novelty. It altered the possibilities of personal violence. A sword, dagger, or club required the attacker to come within reach of the victim and risk being recognised or resisted. A small firearm allowed a killer to strike suddenly, create confusion through noise and smoke, and escape while witnesses were still trying to understand what had happened. On a misty November morning, the weapon's novelty may have been almost as alarming as the identity of its victim. Still, the weapon should not be allowed to overshadow Pakington himself. He was not merely an anonymous first entry in a history of gun crime. He was a successful mercer, a husband and father, a representative of London in Parliament, and a man associated with the uncertain beginnings of the English Reformation. His murder attracted attention because of his standing and because religious conflict gave contemporaries a ready explanation for why somebody might want him dead. The case also demonstrates the difficulty of using Tudor chronicles as crime evidence. Bale, Hall, Fox, Stowe and Holinshed were preserving history, but they were also writing within political and religious arguments. Their accounts tell us what later generations believed or wanted readers to believe. They do not provide a reliable substitute for testimony tested in court. No theory closes every gap. A clerical conspiracy fits Pakington's reformist associations, yet the named organisers change from source to source. A hired foreign assassin fits the unusual weapon but rests on late assertion. A condemned man's confession offers drama without corroboration. The responsible conclusion is therefore an unresolved one. Robert Pakington crossed a familiar street and was killed by an attacker nobody could identify. The shot lasted an instant. The argument over who fired it has continued for nearly 5 centuries. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Murder, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactmurder.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/murdercoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.